Welcome to the MHS program. Um, for anyone who may be attending a virtual MHS program for the first time, welcome. We are an independent, nonprofit organization that hosts a wide variety of programs and maintains a research library with millions of pages of correspondence, documents, and printed materials. We host programs on many different topics. Thanks to the support of our members, our programs and library are open to the public for free. We hope you'll return for future events and we'll explore our collections. Of course, if you enjoy our programs, we also hope you'll consider supporting our work by becoming a member. This evening, we are joined by Professor Katie Booth. She teaches writing at the University of Pittsburgh. Her work has appeared in many magazines and online platforms. Booth received a number of prestigious fellowships to support her research, including one from the Massachusetts Historical Society. She was raised in a mixed hearing and deaf family, and this evening she will discuss her book, The Invention of Miracles, which explores the complicated story of Alexander Graham Bell and his quest to end deafness. It is worth noting that this story is somewhat controversial, with a number of different interpretations. She will be joined in conversation by Professor Jaipreet Virdi. Professor Virdi is a historian of medicine, technology, and disability. She is an assistant professor at the University of Delaware and author of Hearing Happiness, Deafness Cures in History. I would also like to thank our ASL interpreters who are joining us from Partners Interpreting. Finally, I think it's worth mentioning that the MHS is planning to host a series of programs and seminars exploring disability history in October of 2021. We are still in the planning process for these programs, but I hope you'll check back with us this summer when we have all of our plans announced. Thank you very much, and I'm ready now to turn it over to Professor Booth and Professor Virdi.
Thank you for that introduction, Gavin. I am Jaipreet Virdi. By way of audio description, I am a South Asian woman with short curly black hair, wearing a black blouse and a white pattern blazer, and I am sitting in front of a book wall. It is my absolute pleasure to be in conversation tonight with Katie Booth, whose wonderful book, The Invention of Miracles, as Gavin said, unpacks this complicated legacy surrounding Alexander Graham Bell. But I think it also opens up more interesting interpretation, but also interesting historical analysis of what it means to be deaf and what it means to be hearing, or be hearing living within the in-betweeners of deafness and hearing. Before I turn the floor over to Katie, I want to emphasize that what I really like about the book is that, Katie, you handle this complicated legacy by also introducing your own personal narrative into the story. Your family has 2 generations of hereditary deafness, and you grew up, as you tell us, between these 2 worlds of spoken English and American Sign Language, that is between hearing and deafness. But your own experiences as a hearing person who's very fluent in ASL also fits in this in-betweeners. And your experiences, as you tell us, is also one of a hearing person adjacent to deafness. So I'm very thrilled as a deaf person to be in conversation with you today. One thing that comes so clearly in the narrative I found is this power of storytelling. You've interwoven the generations of deaf stories that you found in the archive, but also that's been passed on through your own families and your own stories, and of course, the stories of Alexander Graham Bell, his family, his scientific collaborators, as well as his own students. And I believe that this is a passage you've chosen to read for us today, so I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Jaipreet. I so admire your work, and also the way that story comes into your historical work. So I'm really honored to be here with you tonight, and honored to be at the Massachusetts Historical Society, again, if only virtually. I'm going to read a little bit from the prologue of the book, and it's worth noting that it is a little bit abridged, so there's pieces missing from it, but hopefully it will read pretty smoothly. Oh, and sorry, I forgot. By way of audio description, I am a white woman with medium long brown hair and a black cardigan. Sorry, I forgot that. In the hospital bed, my grandmother faced the window, bathed in the bluish light of the rising moon. I watched her body, memorizing it. The wrinkles of her fingers, the way her jawbone tucked back into her neck, the way her tongue moved like a soft oyster in the shell of her mouth. I had known her my whole life, but I had never before seen her like this. Now it was hard to look at her. The roundness of her body, which once seemed so soft and warm, was only heavy, seemed only to pin her to the hospital bed. Her usual facial expression, eyes sharp, mouth firm, was now tired, resigned. Her head lay on the pillow, her thin gray hair, oily, was swept back from her face. Her eyes were blank and dark. She wasn't dead, not yet, but something had shifted. Normally, I saw my grandmother in her home among her deaf community, where apartments were set up with blinking lights for alarms, where telephones released little scrolls of typed English, and where furniture was arranged for open sight lines in order to use American Sign Language across rooms. She lived among the culturally deaf, defined by the use of ASL and the observation of deaf cultural norms. In those spaces, my grandmother had more access to information than I did. With friends, she communicated in quick, fluent ASL, and even when I could catch the gist of individual words, I could also tell there were layers and layers of meaning that were escaping me. In her world, she was firm, strong, steady. But here in the hospital, things were different. My grandmother had suffered a heart attack 4 days before and had been in the hospital alone for the 3 days that followed. Only then did anyone get in touch with our family. In the meantime, my grandmother's presence barely seemed to have registered. My grandmother, through notes scrawled in English, had made several requests, few of which seemed to have been addressed. She asked for someone to contact us and for a TTY, a text-based telephone device, so that she could call us herself. She had asked for an interpreter at least 4 times before we arrived and had received one only once. With almost no information, she went on waiting for us. For those 3 days, we had no idea she was lying there. I was 19 at the time, and I took a late night Greyhound bus back from college and accompanied my mother to the hospital the next morning. Now, from my grandmother's room, my ears strained to hear my mother. I could capture phrases like Americans with Disabilities Act and informed consent and civil rights, legal code words that culminated in violation of federal law. My mother was battling for my grandmother's right to access her own language, her right to understand and to be understood. By this point, in the early 2000s, the broader deaf community had been entrenched in this fight for nearly 150 years. They'd been fighting ever since one of the foremost teachers of the deaf began to say that ASL was unnecessary, that the deaf could do without it and should be forced to, if necessary. In the hearing world, this teacher is renowned, but not for the generations-long struggle he began. He's known as a plucky inventor, a man who helped people communicate across cities, across nations, across oceans. In the deaf world, however, he's remembered with rage. He's the man who launched a war in which the deaf would have to fight for their lives. And I'll end there.
Thank you for that beautiful prologue. You know, it is actually one of my favorite parts of the book. And I think there's something here about opening up with such an emotional narrative that brings us in as the reader into the story that you're telling throughout the pages. So this book is clearly personal and poignant, especially the prologue, which we've just heard here. But there's anger here too, I think, and it's anger that really comes across in your writing against Bell's lasting harm on deaf people, which it comes across to me like you're not making any attempt to hide this anger here, like you're drawing on it as you're writing. Did you always want to tell this story about Alexander Graham Bell? And before you answer, audience, I also want to mention that if you have a question you would like us to answer, please put your question in the Q&A box that is in the bottom of the screen and not in the chat, okay? Go ahead, Katie.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I first I'll speak a little bit just to the anger, which is a part of the book, in large part because it was a part of the cultural story that was passed down to me that I was trying to, in some way, honor in this book. There's often sort of an unquestioning glorification of many figures. And I think it's important to understand that that's not everybody's experience, especially of Bell. So did I always want to write this? No. I really resisted writing a story about Bell. This story began with me wanting to write about oralism. And it began with the Clark School for the Deaf, actually. I went, many of my family members went there, and in the beginning of the research, I reached out to several alum from there and talked to them about their experiences of oralism. And I wanted to draw on my own family's stories too. But what I learned as time went on, and as I kept talking about this story, was that it kind of wasn't much of a story. And I'm a storyteller. I wanted to tell a story. And the other thing that I noticed was that when I told hearing people about this project, I mean, Bell was always going to be a part. He had to be, because he was such a force in oralism. But what I found was that people really perked up. They were really interested in Bell, and they really didn't know anything about this history. So thinking about that, and then realizing how much of the story of oralism and the complications of oralism were present in Bell's story, I thought I would sort of harness that and use the story of Bell to tell not just the story of this part of his life, but also the stories about oralism, about the students, about my family, and to sort of braid those together in a way, or bring them together. But I will say that the pieces of the book that are about my family, especially my grandfather, were the earliest stories I ever tried to write. My grandfather had this incredible impact on me as a child, and it's stories of him that I've been writing over and over and over again since his death, since I was a child.
Yeah, I think it's that old adage that you write what you know. You know, we find stories in our lives around us. And I think about how I learned about Bell in the first place. I mean, you know, did Katie, like I'm deaf. I have like 98% hearing loss, but I was raised in an oral education because my family were all hearing, and I was never formally taught any form of sign language. And I think my experiences shaped my world. I did my training as an historian, and I first encountered the story about Bell's legacy within the deaf community in grad school in a class of social sciences, where we're talking about thinking of social impact of scientific technology. And that was the very first time I encountered Bell's story, and reading about him in my own time, in a way I could trace the legacy of that harm that you discussed, you know, like how deaf people responded to his writing and responded to his advocacy of oralism. And I think it goes back to what you were saying about where we find the familiar and the unfamiliar in this story. And I think sometimes this is not always what we plan to do as writers. We find like a project and we fixate ourselves on this project, and it takes us through this uncharted territory. Right? So I mean, then for you at least, this has been a 15-year journey. And I think a lot of people who might be joining us tonight might be unfamiliar with just how long it takes to research and write history, especially a biography. So, what was this process like for you personally as you were working on the invention of miracles?
Yeah, yeah, it takes a long time. I'm sure you know that as well. I mean, it began, like I said before, as a smaller project. If in undergrad, actually, it was a project for a class I was taking, where I started going to the Clark School for the Deaf. So it actually began with these really specific stories. But when it became bigger, I realized I had to really educate myself about a lot of things. A lot of like the broad movements of deaf history, disability history, technology history to some extent. And I read a lot of books in that period, but what I found was there wasn't the story wasn't there. There were pieces of story. There was like an outline, but it wasn't really until I started looking at the letters, the primary sources, the diaries, photographs, or even historical deaf newspapers had tremendous detail in them. And that's where all the most exciting stuff is. And yet it is also at the same time the most sort of grueling, boring work. You have to read so many letters, so many journals, and anyone who has kept a journal knows that most of what goes into it is not very interesting. So it was just very, very time consuming to do that work, to find those details. And I think the other thing is that because deaf history, generally speaking, hasn't been very valued, all of those the details that were important to me hadn't been digitized as widely. They hadn't been found. They hadn't been recorded in ways that were quick. So it took a lot of time in archives, a lot of reading very boring things to find individual gems.
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, speaking as an historian, I can admit that the process can be incredibly boring at times. But the thing is, like, historians also talk about finding joy in the archive. Like, after days of doing the tedious process, going through journals or letters, you find that aha moment, or that moment where you just hold on as you're writing or as you're researching. So did you have a favorite story that you uncovered while you were researching Bell's biography? Maybe his relationship with his family?
Yeah. I mean, there were a lot of stories that were fun to uncover. One of my favorite little threads. The funny thing about Bell is, though I didn't think I would like him, he has real, I mean, he's a human and had really funny, quirky, interesting things about him. And maybe my favorite fun story was that when he was in Europe with his family, his wife and his two daughters, he felt like his daughters were bored, or maybe, honestly, maybe he was bored. So he bought 2 monkeys to keep with them in the hotel. And then throughout the archive, you see these tiny little references to these monkeys. They came with them back to America. They tried to, Bell really wanted them to live in the house with them. His wife was just really not interested in that. And yet the monkeys really loved Mabel. And they would sleep on her hands, and then she couldn't do things, but she was too soft to scoot them away. So there's stories like that, but I think the story that hit me the hardest when I was literally in the archive was reading about Bell's death through Mabel's journey, or Mabel's journals, rather. She had this, I mean, it was her husband. She was very heartbroken. And the way it came out were these layers of detail. She would go over the story once, and then a little bit later it'd come out in a different way. And I'll never forget sitting in that archive, which is generally I mean, not at the Massachusetts Historical Society, but most archives are pretty sterile. And there were people all over the place, and I was just trying not to cry. I mean, you could just see this struggle emerging on the page, and it was incredibly powerful.
Thank you for sharing that. I think a lot of people are unfamiliar just how much of an impact it can be for us when we're reading these documents, because there's something very tactile about holding that piece of paper, knowing it was written by the person that you're researching, and it creates this three-dimensional aspect of the story that you're trying to write. And I think when we're writing about deaf history, especially when we think about writing stories of deaf people who signed, it's so hard to find traces of their lives in the archive if there are no written records. I mean, the archive, as we know, is a process, like it's a very selective process about what is kept, what is created, what is maintained, and whose stories become valuable enough to be preserved in history. I mean, it's very intentional thing here. And even when I was writing about, deaf people who were selecting different kinds of treatment in my own book, I found it really difficult to find stories of deaf people. So you end up looking in the in-between stages, finding stories written of deaf people that are narrated by scientists, teachers, public health officials, bureaucrats, etc. But we try to be generous to these stories too, like knowing that they are written through expert eyes. I want to turn the conversation a little bit towards, I think, the controversy that's surrounding your book, in particular, the hostility that we know from history that the deaf communities had towards A.G. Bell and his eugenics views. I mean, specifically, like his positive eugenics view, like he wanted deaf people to be very selective regarding their marriage partners and be, what's the word I'm looking for? Be more conscious about the hereditary makeup of their family. And you write about this in this book, and I can chime in as an historian of science that in the late 19th and early 20th century, positive eugenics was very popularized by many sectors of society. Choosing the right mate and having healthy children was also perceived to be a public health goal, like having stronger, fitter babies and growing the population. And one of the things about Bell is he saw speech as part of their social uplift, like as a way for deaf people, not just to assimilate in society. I don't think so. I think it was more about recognizing the contribution of deaf people in society, like being recognized as upstanding citizens, so to speak. So for Bell, speech was a vehicle to social uplift or attempting to normalize deaf people. But he had this lifelong dream, and I think the dream also comes from his father as well, who also taught speech to deaf people. So A.G. Bell's dream was to establish a school for deaf children, which he did in DC in 1883. But by its third year, the school failed. So how do you think this impacted Bell's own philosophy of oralism and how he perceived his role as an educator?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, yeah, so Bell, he started a school, and it was sort of, it went along with these ideas that Jaipreet just outlined, in that the upper level of the school, the second story of the school, was the deaf school. And then the first story was for hearing children. And during education time, these two groups were segregated. But during any sort of recreational time or meals or anything like that, he brought the two groups together. He really did have this vision of hearing people and deaf people living together harmoniously. There were problems with the way he enacted that vision, but that was his idea. Unfortunately, like you said, the school failed in its third year. And I think this was a really critical point in Bell's journey, because Bell is not the simple villain that I grew up thinking he was. He was a very complicated man. His interactions with the deaf world were very complicated. His interactions with eugenics were very complicated. I'll just quickly say that Brian Greenwald, who teaches at Gallaudet, has done incredible research into Bell and eugenics, if anyone's curious about that. But I think at this moment when his school closed, he had an opportunity to look at what happened, to look at the possibility that oralism, as he envisioned it, wasn't working. And there's a lot of evidence just looking back at the historical record that I can see of that. And Bell didn't do that. He really, he sort of pinned that loss on other failures of teachers, the fact that he was pulled away from the school to work on the telephone litigation again. He just thought it was other things. And I didn't see a lot of introspection about oralism at that moment, even though his students did not have what he hoped they would have. I mean, he gave them a test to find out what they would do if they were on the street and lost, how they would interact with somebody. And instead of answering the questions they were asked, they just repeated the words back to him. They couldn't quite understand the scenario. And he said at that time, in real anger, he was very upset. He thought that these students were not being taught to think. He said that there are things more important than learning how to speak well, that their minds couldn't be neglected. He said all of these things, but he never integrated that information. And instead, what he did was veer off even further into eugenics, which was very tied to his ideas of oralism.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of contradiction here that you outline in Bell's thinking, he's saying that it's important for a student to understand, and speech is not the only vehicle for that. And yet at the same time, still kind of expecting that. Now, that was very typical of a lot of educators in the late 19th and early 20th century, because the process of providing deaf education hadn't yet been standardized. I mean, there were models in which education could proceed. There was a model coming out of French teacher, there was a model in Britain, and there was an American one as well. And each tied, I think, to different ideas about what does education do? Like, what's the point of education? Is it to raise upstanding citizens who would then be employed, pay taxes, get married, have more babies, and continue growing upstanding citizen? Is it about just speech, or is it about something more? And I think Bell fit in the legacy of educators who were struggling about how education could be tied to citizenry and more broadly, what it means to be a normal citizen. And I think this is when we see the eugenics guides coming to be so closely tied with education here. I mean, even other educators at that time viewed articulation training like speech or assisted speech or outright oralism as being important tools for deaf education for achieving that understanding that you've just mentioned. Thomas Gallaudet, for instance, saw articulation as something that could be used by some students, not all, in order to gain education. So he wasn't always advocating for one or the other, like sign language or speech, but more about, all the tools that are at disposal, all the tools that a child has, which one works best for them to achieve success, which one allows them to elevate their rationality and understanding. So did Bell differ from this view? Like, did you find that he had a distinctly separate view of oralism, or in your research, did you see his oralism just being a product of the times?
Mm. Um, thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's a very complicated question, and it was a very complicated time, especially in the early days of oralism. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of wondering. There were a lot of people on both sides who were smart and well-intentioned. And I think the thing that was, well, when Bell started, he actually wasn't so strictly against sign language, but he sort of veered more extreme in that view in terms of the classroom. Bell himself saw sign as a complete language. He advocated for interpreters in courtrooms way ahead of his time, but he didn't think deaf children should be using it. And I think that was what made the oralism that he was promoting different from more flexible models that included both sign language and then also offered speech training to students who seemed to be predisposed to it or who were benefiting from it. Bell didn't have that flexibility when it came to deaf children. He did not want sign anywhere in the classroom. And so as for him being a product of his time, I think that Bell, I mean, of course, we're all a product of our time. I think the reason that I think Bell has a little bit more culpability than is usually ascribed to him is that he was part of a broader conversation in which deaf leaders and deaf educators were observing the damages of oralism. They didn't know exactly what was going on completely, but they could tell that students were struggling and that things were going badly. And as students were graduating through this system, many of them were also speaking to that, both on their own behalf, but then also saying what they observed of the other children they were educated with. And Bell was tapped into those conversations for a time. And I think what is tragic about Bell, and the thing that feels almost unforgivable, is that he had access to that information. He saw it in his own school, and yet he turned away. So when you have these conversations about like men of their times, the idea is that they didn't have all of the information. The other idea is often just the complete erasure of resistance. But the idea that Bell didn't have access to that information isn't true. And I think that's what makes him a little bit different than maybe other figures.
And clearly the fact that he was gaining the global reputation as a scientist, of course, lent him authority in some senses. And one of the things we know so clearly about Bell, and I think most of us are taught this in grade school in the Western world, is that he's the inventor of the telephone. And for those of us who are trained in history science, we know, Bell also had views about eugenics. And again, you mentioned Brian Greenwald's work, and everyone, I strongly support that. Go read Professor Greenwald's work. It is really incredible. But it also raises the distinction. I think most of us tend to forget that there is negative eugenics and positive eugenics. And Bell disavowed negative eugenics, which require people being sterilized and preventing from being married and, reproducing. But he was, in some cases, very clear that he favored positive eugenics. And I think Professor Greenwald really speaks to this. And I think another recently published book is by Marion Schmidt, who writes the history of the Clark School and all of the numerous programs on genetics and heredity. So if you're looking for your next reading material, check out these books. The book is called Eradicating Deafness. I just turn around to see if I have it, and I don't. It's somewhere else. But, it really, I think we've seen in the past 5 years much more complicated history, new history encouraging, I think, tough, complex questions about historical figures, and no longer taking for granted about the grand legacy, like Bell, the inventor, Bell, the telephone, who after God moved into a patent dispute. So, as historians of technology have uncovered, and this is something, Katie, as you know, I also touch upon in my own work, is Bell's technological pursuits were also kind of started as a way to create machines to teach deaf people speech. And you uncover in his book, in your book, this drive to show his genius, like his technological genius, and make a living as an inventor as well. But did you find it challenging as we're working on the invention of miracle to unravel these, I think, tangled histories of Bell the inventor and Bell the educator?
Yes. It was very complicated. I mean, as you know, my interest was in deafness. It was in his impact on the deaf world. I I kind of wanted to avoid the telephone altogether, but I couldn't. And in fact, I'm glad that I couldn't, because I think one of the damaging things that has happened in many histories about Bell is that they have been separated. And usually the history of deafness and his relationship to the deaf world has been segregated off to like a chapter or two, or sort of segmented. It doesn't feel quite connected. And I felt like I mean, we started this conversation thinking about anger and this anger that I began this project with. But I also was really curious, and I think that was what drove the project forward. If I were only angry, I would not have been able to write this book. I mean, I couldn't have. And what I was curious about was really, how did this happen? How did this happen? Why did it happen? And how did we end up with this man who was not the villain that I grew up believing he was, not the simple, evil sort of caricature that I understood as a child. He was very complicated. His legacy in eugenics is very complicated. His legacy in the deaf world is very complicated. And I felt it was important to put that story back together, especially because they are so entwined. You cannot tell the story of his work with the deaf without acknowledging the power and the celebrity that came from the telephone. And you can't also, like, there are so many moments in his work with the deaf that the distraction of the telephone was very real and very harmful, I think, to that work. So I wanted to put that story back together. I felt it was important to put that story back together, to take, like you talked earlier about how many histories of deaf people have just been lost. Or maybe that's too passive a term. I mean, they have not been, there's been no work by many institutions to save and preserve and honor those histories. And I felt it was important to not just put Belle's story back together, but to find as many of those stories as I could. And they were very hard to find. But to try my best to pull that story in as well, and to create a narrative that would help us understand something about what really happened.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what you just said about preserving and honoring that story, no, this is something that I think all institutions have to take into account moving forward. Like, where do we find these disability stories? Where do we find, like, how do we find ways to keep these stories in our archive and our museum that both honors the stories of the community, of the people, but also, I think, gives space for different types of sources. I mean, I'm thinking, just to give you one brief example, I'm thinking about how in one of the archives, when I was working on my book, there was a folder of workman's comp information by a deaf person. And it was clear that there was a lot of communication issues because there's all these letters sent by the workman's comp to the deaf man asking him why he didn't show up for their meeting. And then in one of the papers, as I flipped over, there was all these scribbles. And I realized at that moment, this man communicates through sign language. He might not have spoken English, and he's struggling to like communicate to get his benefits. And I think this is, being deaf, I was able to see this, but it made me wonder how many people must have missed this story or don't find it as valued or see them just as scrap pieces of paper. So, there is something about being in the archives and trying to make sense of the materials that are in front of us, but also acknowledging that history is a process of interpretation. We work with our primary sources. We tell the story based on how we cross-reference these primary sources and talk to experts and so forth. So I think you explaining this tangled history that is quite challenging in the writing process. No, we have a lot of questions. Thank you, audience. This is great, but we don't have a lot of time. So I'm going to highlight some questions for you to answer. And the first one comes from Dean Gordon because it fits with what we just talked about. And Mr. Gordon said, this is an excellent book. In my observation, most biographers admire their subject, and some despise them. Some grow disillusioned with them as they work. For you, Katie, has seemed to start despising your subject and then grew to respect him in some degree. Was there a moment when you, like a specific moment when you remember your shift of like your perspective of Bell shifting?
Wow, that's a good question. Hi, Dean. Dean was I met Dean through the Massachusetts Historical Society. I don't remember a specific moment, but I do remember, it might have been, I think there were a few things. One was the observation in a book called The Deaf Mute Howls by Albert Ballin. I might be messing up his name, but he talked about Bell. He was a deaf man who was very anti-oralist, and he liked Bell. He didn't agree with Bell, but he really liked Bell. And I read that book very early on, and I think that was the first moment where I was like, what's going on here? That was a hint to me that there was more to this person than I understood. But I think the moment he really became human to me was when I was reading about his courtship of Mabel, who began as one of his students. Mabel herself was deaf, and he just fell madly in love with her, ended their lessons as soon as he sort of realized that, and went on this sort of tangled journey to try to win her heart. And it's not, I mean, I think he makes some maybe missteps along the way, but you couldn't read these letters and not recognize his humanity. And I think that might have been a turning point as well.
Well, here's a related question. So there are several questions, I think, asking about contemporary language training and language deprivation and cochlear implants and sign language, which I don't think really fits in the historical narrative, but it could be like the extension of some of the things you're talking about. So here's a question I think that kind of brings some of these different viewpoints together. And it comes from Ted Evans, who says, hello from London. If A.G. Bell could see language deprivation still harming so many deaf people today, as well as the advancement of hearing technology, how do you think he would react or feel? Would he accept that autism isn't for everyone, or would he be hell-bent on correcting it still?
I don't know. I do think he would be horrified to see language deprivation continuing. I really do. I think he would, yeah, he did care, and I think that would break his heart. It broke his heart when he saw it happening in his time. But I do wonder, the thing that happened with Bell is, one of the things is he became incredibly sort of stubborn and narrow-minded about oralism. And it could be that he would continue that. But I really don't know. He was a complicated person. It would probably depend on whether or not he found his way back to deaf leadership.
But then here's a related question. So I mean, you mentioned that AGB is a complex person and not a billion, as you initially saw him. But there are still deaf people today who see him as a billion. How do you acknowledge that? Like, do you feel like does that perspective still needs to be honored while also complicating AGB's biography?
Yes, I think we need to honor that perspective. I don't think anybody should try to change that perspective. I would be horrified if that was something that came out of my book. Bell created generations of trauma in the deaf community. And if it brings peace to people to see him as a villain, I think, great. I don't think that's hurting anybody. And it might be helping people. I don't think deaf people who feel hurt by Bell have any obligation to read my book or to reckon with Bell's humanity. I do think that hearing people should. I think that hearing people are those who are more likely to have harmful ignorance about this history that could color the way they see deafness today. Sign language continues to be suppressed. Very few deaf children have access to sign language, even though it could be tremendously helpful in ending language deprivation among deaf children. And a big reason that continues is there's a lot of hearing bias in research because these prejudices are just the water we swim in as hearing people. They are everywhere. They are in us. We carry them. And if we don't become conscious of them, we will perpetuate them and we will perpetuate harm. And so, yeah, I think it's fine for deaf people to see Bell as a villain. I don't think that anybody should take that away from anyone if it brings them some manner of peace.
Yeah, thank you. That's a wonderful answer. And you know, in my own research, I uncovered that even in the early 20th century, hearing parents of deaf children were still going to Bell for advice on where to find like the latest surgical cure or ear trumpet, I mean, before electric hearing aids were popularized. So it shows that his celebrity, as you describe it, had very long-lasting effects throughout generations. And for some people, there was still that harm, like the power of this man who was in so many scientific boards, was influential in shaping a lot of thinking about genetics and heredity and disability. You know, it creates the ripple effect throughout the generation. And we have time for one last question. This is more of a historical question, which is probably why I'm drawn to it. But this comes from Peter Drummy, who asks, can you say a little more about the role of the Clark School in the history of oralism? Or if you're capable, Katie, the entire history of oralism before Bell comes to the stage in very like condensed manner.
Oh, really quick then. Hi, Peter. Peter was also at the Historical Society when I was there. So the Clark School for the Deaf was they call it the first permanent oralist school for the deaf in America. The Lexington School was also happening right around the same time. But Clark has a very specific, I think, role in cultural memory. It was a very strong oralist perspective that influenced a lot of other schools. And that school was actually founded for Mabel, who was Belle's wife. So that's sort of how I ended up with the Bells so quickly. When Mabel became deaf at age 5 or so, her father, who was very rich and influential, wanted her to be normalized or to remain normal. And he eventually sort of founded this school based on those principles. She never attended it. She had a private tutor. But the Clark School was a real stronghold of oralism. And Bell taught there. He toured. He taught at a lot of different schools. And basically, when Bell came to America, oralism was already started because of the Clark School and then several other schools quickly after. Before that, it was manualist. It was everybody was taught through sign language. But this is me trying to do a quick history. But basically, oralism was really hard and it wasn't going very well, and parents were frustrated and no one knew what to do. And so when Bell came into the picture, he started to really offer a sense of possibility, both because he was individually a very good teacher and because he was a presenter. He could create a performance that convinced people that this could really work. And somebody on Twitter phrased it as like steroids for oralism. Like they were weak and then suddenly Bell came on and they had more, oralism had more strength. And he was sort of this energy that pushed it forward when it was languishing.
Absolutely. You know, the history of not just oralism as a pedagogy, but just articulation and speech training is a very long history. There's some really wonderful work written by historians. Just off the top of my head, in case the audience is interested, R.A.R. Edwards, who is at the Rochester Institute for the Deaf, wrote a wonderful book called Words Made Flesh. And it explored the 19th century efforts to introduce oralism in American schools. So on that note, just Katie, do you have any final remarks? It's been an absolute pleasure having this conversation with you, and I want you to have the last word before we switch over to Gavin.
I don't know. I just really encourage people also to look into Jaipreet's book, Hearing Happiness. The way she brings together not just real hardcore like historical research, but also infuses the book with historical stories and also personal narrative. It's really masterful, and yeah, I encourage you to look into that book as well, and to support local booksellers and all of that good stuff. And thank you for coming. I so appreciate it.
Well, I just want to thank all of our audience for attending, and thank you, Professor Booth, and thank you, Professor Virdi, for a wonderful presentation. And before everyone disappears, we do always encourage people to support locally owned bookstores. And this evening, we're suggesting that you could buy this book through Women and Children's First Bookstore, and we've included the link there. So I hope that if you enjoy the discussion, you'll consider buying a copy of the book. And thank you all, and I hope you have a great evening and enjoy the nice spring weather.